Welcome back, everybody. Sorry for the delay between episodes, but we're back and we've got a lot to cover. Today, we're going to focus on items and item displayers so we can start building out our inventories. Firstly, let's talk about items. In Foundry, items are not just tangible items like swords and potions, but they can actually be your character's race, class, and background. You can create items the same way you create actors, so let's go ahead and head to the Item tab and create a new item template. Now, I could make item templates for each type of sword in existence, whether it be a curved sword, a straight sword, or a rapier, or maybe generally all weapons could share the same template. The number and the depth of your templates is really going to depend on your system's needs and your design style. Before making any templates, you should really stop and consider the big picture before it all just gets too messy. So specifically think about what information your item will need to display and contain and its mechanical purposes, and see what kind of overlap exists. For example, does our system use a tagging system to differentiate weapons, such as giving spears a reach property? Further, when comparing swords and bows, bows often have a specific range value measured in feet or meters and consume arrows to use. Would that require a whole new template for ranged weapons specifically, or could we just hide the range and consumable options via a drop-down that enables us to see them and fill them out? Finally, if you have components or groups of components that will be used frequently between item templates, such as a basic description or value panel, you can drag components in from one template to another, or create a sub-template and drag that directly from your item sidebar to your templates. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I'll go ahead and make a sub-template for our item value and description, as well as a weapon and loot template that uses those sub-templates, and a sword and dagger item. Now back to our actor sheet. If I drag my sword item onto our actor, nothing really changes, and this is an important clue to how the item displayers will actually work. Specifically, item displayers don't actually contain items. As their name might indicate to you, they display items that meet the criteria that we enter when setting them up. That means that one sword can appear across multiple displayers at the same time, or nowhere in our sheet at all, despite our actor actually containing that sword, as we see now. So let's go down the list of component settings for the item displayer. The displayer title places text above our table, acting like a name for our entire table. I'll not be using this presently, so I'll just leave it blank since I've kind of already managed something similar using our tabbed panel names. The item reference column label changes the default column's heading, which is name by default, but I plan to hide the table headings anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave that as default. We can quickly align the content of our rows to be left, right, or center, but to me, left is going to look the best nearly always, so I'm just going to again leave that blank. Quickly moving on, our item displayers can contain text if they contain no items would meet the criteria for that displayer, which could be useful for a character's race, indicating that there's no race selected or something to notify the player that they need to make a change, but this is not necessarily something I care about for our backpack, so again, I'll go ahead and leave it empty. We can also choose to hide the entire displayer if it's empty, hiding our column names or bolding the names, and for this container, I'll be hiding the names so there's no need to really bold them, and I don't really want to hide the entire container if it's empty since we will be doing some cool stuff with the CSS styling later. Next up, we can enable item creation within the displayer, which adds a new button to our item displayer, which opens a dialog box quickly walking us through creating items. It's important to note only players with the item creation permission have access to see this button regardless of sheet ownership. Enabling the setting will actually generate some more options for us to choose from to control how that dialog will present information to us, like what template the item should use by default, the title of the pop-up, the text on the confirm button, and the default item name. And I'll go ahead and fill this information out for creating a simple loot item that adventurers are likely to find, but I might have not created in advance. Moving down the list, we can hide the option to delete items from this table. Again, that can be useful for things like our race displayer, but not necessarily our backpack. But we'll go ahead and enable the confirmation dialog box just as a safety precaution. We also have the option to enable an item status option that is only visible to the game master, and it does work as a quick shortcut to open the item's template, but I tend to navigate through item templates through the item itself, and so I don't really have much of a use for this, and I'll leave it off. Hidden columns allow us to make columns that are not visible on the actor sheet, and this is great for indexing or referencing values to our displayer and subsequently elsewhere on our character sheet without creating noisy visuals. However, we can use our normal visibility setting on each column as we make those, or CSS to hide columns without an issue. So you can take your preference on how you want to hide your reference columns, and I personally won't be using this section. Next, we can go ahead and sort our entries, as in organizing the items in our displayer. By default, the manual option is chosen, which creates arrows beside our items which we can use to manually move items up or down the list. We can also disable item sorting entirely, which might be useful for our displayer that only contains one item, or maybe if they need to be ordered by when they were added to the sheet. And finally, we have the option to automatically sort our items, which allows us to create a formula to effectively handle the sorting for us. I'll start by go ahead and defining a column key called item favored with an equal operator to value true. So if item favored resolves to true for each row, it'll return to the top. I'll go ahead and add a second sort criteria by name and ascending, so it's alphabetized. Now going into the item, I can create a checkbox called favorited. And I can go back to the item displayer, click the plus sign to create a new row, and check if that checkbox is true. I'll name that column item favorited so that it works with our sorting criteria that we set up earlier. Let's go ahead and create a formula that first checks if an item is favorited by checking the item's checkbox with the favorited key. We do that by adding this item.prefix, which tells Custom System Builder within this item displayer's row, which is related to a specific item, go get that component key from that item. And this only does work in item displayers. So you can't go elsewhere in your character sheet and reference item dot. If you want to get referenced information from an item to elsewhere in the character sheet, you'll need to first reference it to a column and then use the lookup function to reference it outside of that displayer. Now that we're sorting all favorited items to the top, let's go ahead and add a second sorted filter to make it alphabetical. This means that all favorited items will appear in a first list that's alphabetized, and then all unfavored items will appear below the last favorited item and start a second alphabetized list. We could also use two separate item displayers for this if we wanted to display them in separate areas of our character sheet, or maybe wanted some drastically different styling on them using CSS. However, I'll go over some cool ways to handle this within one item displayer when we get into styling. Finally, the last two sections are covering filtering. We can go ahead and choose what items are displayed via templates, so we'll go ahead and check the weapons and loot, so both will appear within our bag. This means that for our race container, we can actually check the race template once we've made that, and that will mean that only items that are using the race template, which should only be our character's race, will appear very easily within our race container and not show up in our backpack, for example. And that would also help prevent random loot from appearing in the race container. The formula field allows us a lot more flexibility when filtering items that's not just based on template, meaning that we could actually filter here whether or not our item is favorited if we wanted to show up in our bag. This also means that we could show if our item is equipped or not for our equipment section, which is something that we will be doing later, or if a condition is active. You can really get creative with the formula section and come up with all sorts of cool ways of filtering or changing what items are being displayed. And I'd love to see what you've done with this in the Discord, so feel free to tag me with any of your cool inventions. Moving on, let's go ahead and confirm our item displayer setup, and our sword should appear within it. Also create a second displayer in our feature section, and as you can see, our sword appears in both. But if we delete the item from either, it'll also disappear from both. And this goes back to where I mentioned that the displayers are just showing what meets the filter criteria, despite how many times they do or don't appear in the actor itself. So I'll go ahead and add our sword back to our actor and disable loot and weapon templates from our features displayer. That way it will only appear in our backpack. Next up, I'll go ahead and make a button that changes whether or not the item is favorited from the bag itself, rather than having to open the item every single time. And we'll do that by creating a new column and using this example from the wiki. To very briefly explain it, we're creating a space on the character sheet that looks like a checkbox using HTML and CSB notation. The main thing that we're going to be worried about is right here in the class section that says FA-. This notation checks whether or not the checkbox that has the component key equipped is enabled within the item. We'll go ahead and change that to be favorited. If the item is in fact favorited, the formula will resolve to FA² check, which we can see this asset directly on font awesome. If the formula results to false, it actually shows an unchecked square. And the same logic is similarly repeated in the color section to change the color of that square just so it looks a little more visually different. This checkbox doesn't actually do anything on its own. For example, if I go ahead and confirm its creation now and click it, nothing happens. It's just a visual display. However, by entering this formula on the label role message, when the element is clicked, CSB will run that formula, which changes the checkbox and therefore changes the formula, which is affecting the display, adding the checkbox and changing it to green, for example. If that doesn't make any sense, don't worry. I plan to cover this in a lot more detail when we go over HTML, CSS, and more applications of CSB notation. I just wanted to show you what the columns did for the item displayer specifically and how you can use them to do some cool stuff within the displayer. And the same principle can be used for doing a lot of cool things like throwing your item description to chat or actually using the item, rolling damage. And we'll show a lot more examples of that going forward. But for now, this is how we actually use the item column section and how we can use it to make some interactive components within our item displayer, as well as referencing information from our item sheet to our actor sheet, or rather to the displayer. And using the lookup function, you can reference it elsewhere on the character sheet. Don't worry, I plan to cover custom HTML, CSS, and more applications of CSB notation later. For now, I just wanted to show how to actually add a column and some potential uses for it. Item displayers are one of the most powerful tools that we have in Custom System Builder. There are so many opportunities to make cool stuff with this, and we'll be going over a lot of that later. I just needed to show the last function of an item displayer very basically in this episode. So look forward to that in future episodes. In the meantime, we have just built a working checkbox that allows us to quickly favorite and unfavorite items in our bag. As always, you can find the updated version of this tutorial system in the GitHub. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're feeling up to it, check out my Ko-Fi or the CSB clock module that I've made that's been updated to version 13. I did use AI to quickly power through updating it to version 13. And I plan to go back and do it by hand eventually, but just haven't had the time with how hectic things have been in my personal life. So in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode where we cover meters and dynamic tables.